Welcome to our second Future Cities webinar. Today's session is looking at the implications for strategic planning of the energy transition. So my name's Kimberly, I'm part of the marketing team here at the Institute for Manufacturing. So I just thought I'd give you a brief introduction to the IFM for those of you that are new to us. So, the Institute for Manufacturing, or IFM, is a division of the engineering department at the University of Cambridge. We conduct research, teaching and practice activities working with government, universities and industry. The research at the IFM looks from a systems perspective on topics such as innovation management, digitalisation and automation, as well as more overarching themes like sustainability, technology, policy and healthcare. Collaboration, partnerships, dialogue and the exchange of ideas are at the core of our activities. IFM Engage is our embedded knowledge transfer organisation. We run strategic consultancy projects, executive training and membership groups based on approaches and tools developed at the IFM. Our work aims to help organisations to develop innovative solutions and improve the environment for the future, and helps governments and local authorities foster innovation to deliver social, environmental and economic benefits. So that gives us a little bit of a link as to why we are here presenting on this topic today, but my colleague Diana will speak more on that during her presentation. I will now hand over to Jung Hoon, who will be today's host. Professor Lee is the Director of the Centre for Digital Transformation Technology Management at Yonsei University and a visiting academic fellow at the IFM. Over to you, Jung Hoon.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thanks for your kind introductions. Good evening from Seoul, and it's such a great pleasure to hold this event. My name is Jung Hoon, and currently the professor at the Yonsei University as well. It is our second time, and since December, and it is very exciting to actually doing these events with Cambridge IFM Engage, and it is great pleasure to invite our distinguished speakers for today. Let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Simon Bennett, energy analyst at IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, and co-author of the World Energy Outlook. He'll be briefly present about the global energy systems in times of the transition and disruption. And this is very critical period right now with this Ukraine crisis and everything. So I think we very look forward to hearing his speech as well. Again, our second speaker is Dr. Diana Khripko, and she's a senior solution development specialist and the course tutor at IFM Engage at Cambridge as well. She will be presenting her work on how to address the future uncertainties in the municipal energy transitions. And so the floor is yours, Simon.
Thank you, Jung Hoon. Good evening to you in Seoul, but I understand that we have quite an international audience today. So hi to everybody, wherever you are. I'm going to take a moment to try to get my screen shared, but thank you in the meantime for such a nice introduction. I have to say that I am just one small cog in the production of the IEA's World Energy Outlook, which is a major team effort across the IEA. And I work on that publication with colleagues, especially on aspects relating to technology. But I also run some work that the IEA is doing on innovation and trying to answer a bigger question of where do new energy technologies come from and what is the role of government in bringing new technologies into being and bringing them to market. So in terms of today's topic, yes, energy transitions is what the International Energy Agency does. That's our main body of work. Cities is not something that we have a major work stream on. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Diana's presentation and to engaging in this topic. Now, the IEA, for those of you who are not aware, is an intergovernmental organization. We're based in Paris, but we serve the interests of member governments that are across the world. And increasingly, our policy work is working with governments outside of the core members of the IEA who set up the IEA in the 1970s, following the oil crisis. So we're increasingly working with emerging market and developing economies in China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, and across Africa as well. So we really have a global presence now, and that's absolutely necessary in energy, because it's a global topic. It's also globally traded, and as we are realizing through this situation at the moment, the crisis that's unfolding after the invasion of Ukraine, in each individual region is very interlinked with all others, and we're working a lot with the European Union, the European Commission at the moment, on how they can maintain their decarbonization goals whilst managing the impacts of the current crisis and reducing their dependence on Russian fossil fuels. But that's not what we're going to talk about, although I'd be happy to take some questions on that. What I've done instead is I've taken some work from the World Energy Outlook, and I'm going to try to tell a story that I hope people find persuasive. And obviously I'm interested in feedback about whether or not that's true. And it's going to go from the IEA's work on the global emissions reduction challenge that comes through our World Energy Outlook, and then through to what that actually means for technologies. And I'm going to make the argument that that challenge brings new requirements for technologies that are small, modular, or more consumer facing. But actually that creates an innovation ecosystem that is well suited to local ecosystems, local generation of knowledge and bringing new products to market. And that cities are potentially a really key launch pad for not only for the new ideas, but also for deploying some of those technologies. So I understand I have about 15 or so minutes, and I'm going to try to get through this, and we'll see if that argumentation lands well with the audience. So I'm going to start with our work on scenarios. I think this is how the IEA often frames its work. Hopefully some people in the audience will be familiar with this, but I'm not sure that everyone will be. So I'll quickly explain our scenarios. We essentially do some work on projecting the nature of the future global energy system from now to 2050. The red line that's on this screen, it shows that before the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, the emissions trajectory of the global energy system was on its way up, and so the way that the world was heading, sort of an extrapolation of business as usual, was putting us on course for about, I think, 3.4, 3.5 degrees of temperature warming. So global surface average temperatures warming by 3.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial periods in this century. In a situation where you have that level of warming, you have heat waves that are 4 times more likely, that are, I think it's five times more likely, but 4 degrees more intensive. Flooding is twice as likely and 20% more intensive by the end of the century. It's not a course that anybody wanted to be on. And following the signing of the Paris Agreement, we saw even more efforts to start to bend the emissions curve. So we came up with a scenario that we tweak and we improve and update every year. It's called our stated policies scenario. And we think this is where emissions are heading in the energy system from fossil fuel combustion. If governments implement all of the policies that they have announced or put onto statute books. And I'm really talking about policies, not just the announcements of long-term targets. And the stated policy scenario gets you to something like 2.6 degrees of warming. So still not a pleasant environment, for a lot of species on the planet, especially by the end of the century. Well, certainly, it's since the Paris Agreement, but I think more so in the last couple of years, there's been a much higher intensity of government target setting to bring the world to what is often described as net zero emissions, usually by around mid-century. And you need to stabilize emissions going into the atmosphere, ideally at around zero, including what's going into the atmosphere netted with maybe what's coming out of the atmosphere, in order to prevent temperature from rising continually. So we have another scenario. It's called our announced pledges scenario. And we put this together for a release in October last year, based on all of the pledges that governments were making to go towards those more ambitious targets. And it's quite a big difference from the stated policy scenario. And it gets you to around 2.1 degrees of warming. But then we brought out the publication before COP, which was in Glasgow last year. And then at COP, Prime Minister Modi in India and others, they introduced new pledges, which were pretty ambitious, because those were some very big economies. We had to do an update of our announced pledges scenario, which for the first time ever brought the world onto a pathway. If all of those pledges were enacted in full and governments met their commitments, then that would actually bring us to a warming of below 2 degrees. It was the first time we were able to say that, something like 1.8 degrees. And that is not, you will note, still on track for the 1.5 degrees of warming that the Paris Agreement actually hopes that the world will meet. That requires reaching net zero emissions by 2050, and that is called our net zero emissions scenario. So in each of these cases, what we're doing is we are taking policies, we're taking targets, and then we are doing the work of optimizing our model to see what would be feasible in terms of the deployment of different technologies all along those decades in order to get to 2050. At what point do you need to meet certain amounts of deployment? What point do you need to meet certain technology goals? That's the big picture. Going down one level, just to give you an example of the challenge of reaching net zero emissions, is this chart, which shows what the electricity supply would look like in 2050 in that net zero emissions scenario. This is global, and it's a big increase in electricity supply, and it's mostly a big increase in solar, photovoltaic, and wind electricity. So that's the workhorse of renewable electricity going into the future. Even though hydro had been the renewable workhorse of the past. So this is by 2030, we need to increase the rate at which we're expanding solar PV and wind by 4 times in this scenario. It's a very, very big and ambitious increase. But as we look at the current crisis and what governments are thinking about in terms of how to perhaps reduce reliance on fossil fuel imports, there are indications that this kind of ramp up might be within grasp. But one of the key things here is we are increasing our electricity supply in order to meet increased electricity demand, and that is because some of the technologies that we'll be needing on the end use side of the energy equation, in transport and in heating, are going to in the future be powered by electricity and not be powered by fossil fuels or other forms of molecular fuels, battery electric vehicles, heat pumps, the electrification of low temperature heat in manufacturing. Those are the ways in which we can transmit low carbon, renewable energy through to specific end uses. We do that via electricity. And obviously, cities have a high density, they have a high level of connectivity, of electricity infrastructure. These are going to be some of the front runners in this deployment on the end use side. So moving from that big picture, we then did a technology breakdown. And this is a slightly complicated chart, but I would like you to concentrate on the right-hand side column, where we have the yellow, orange, and red sections. So what we did is we broke down all of the emissions in that net zero scenario into whether they were being delivered by technologies that are currently in the market. Perhaps they're in an early stage of deployment, but if they're proven and they're in the market, then they go into the green or the blue category. And then the emissions that need to be delivered by 2050 from technologies that are yet to pass through the demonstration phase and reach full market deployment. And we came to the conclusion that around half of the emissions in 2050 would need to come from technologies that are not yet past the demonstration phase. And the reason for this is there's a certain number of sectors, and they're often called hard to abate sectors in heavy industry, so in iron and steel, cement, chemicals, and then in long distance transport, aviation, shipping, trucking, these types of things, where currently there isn't an off-the-shelf technology that you can plug in, that you can operate without CO2 emissions today. So in all scenarios, we don't necessarily know exactly what the technology is going to be in 2050, but in all reasonable scenarios, we need innovation in a big way in order to avoid the emissions that we see. The top gray part of this chart simply shows that what we're doing on the emission side is partly offsetting an increase in activity, an increase in demand that is coming through from mostly emerging and developing economies that still want to get up the prosperity ladder. And so we need to be helping them to have low emissions while at the same time being able to grow their economies. Okay, so this is the importance of innovation. So we now move to what I work on a lot of the time is what type of innovation, what type of technologies are actually needed. And I wanted to make the point that a lot of the past innovation in the energy system has come from large companies that have considerable market power. When we think of energy companies, we really think of either large engineering firms or the companies that extract fossil fuels, or the companies that provide us with electricity and gas to end users. And it's true that those companies often had big R&D labs, that they were responsible for much of the technology improvements that brought us nuclear power, that brought us natural gas combined cycle turbines, and all kinds of other things operated at a relatively large scale. We are now entering a different world. The technologies that are receiving the most investment today, we're not even talking about the future, are smaller scale. They have quicker replacement cycles, they have more standardized designs, and I think of importance to the Institute of Manufacturing, these technologies can be mass produced, and that puts them onto learning curves where cost reductions can be foreseen and can come down very, very quickly. So what are we thinking about is driving this trend? Well, one of the things is deregulation and power market reform. We don't have vertically integrated monopolies so much in the power system. It's easier to get a toehold in the market. But smart and digital technologies are a big part of this. That's where a lot of the innovation is coming from. Those are smaller scale, they have faster innovation life cycles. And as we move to a more electrified world, electronics and electrochemistry tend not to follow chemical engineering economies of scale. They tend to be technologies that you put together in a modular way, and you don't design for very large scales from the outset. I've already mentioned manufacturing, but rapid prototyping is a big part of faster innovation cycles. And then there's this whole area of technologies that we will not reach net zero without. And the types of technologies that typically were not included when people thought of energy technologies. They are consumer technologies. They're things that individuals are going to be buying for their homes and for their vehicles in terms of batteries, in terms of smart devices, ways in which they will interact with the electricity grid, and provide a resource to the electricity system in new business models and ways that provide value to consumers. So consumer choices are going to drive this. And when you have consumer technologies, you can have a lot more product differentiation. You can sell to a wealthier group of individuals at the beginning, and then as you bring down costs, you can go to other segments of the market. I don't think this is rocket science for many of you on the call. We also have more of an interest in venture capital among venture capitalists to invest in clean energy technologies, and venture capitalists are very good at taking new ideas and finding them the right path that is quickest to get to market with the technology, and then maybe sort of improving and finding the right niche, pivoting to a different sort of market niche as they evolve. And I think VC money is having quite a big impact now on the way in which clean energy technologies are being developed. The last point on this slide really just makes the point that we're not moving into a world, in our view, where we only have those types of small scale technologies. We still need bigger, more familiar, large scale projects in heavy industry as well. And the key thing is that policy wise, all of these different technologies need to be incentivized appropriately. And we've been doing some work, for example, on how governments are incentivizing and supporting startups to deliver clean energy technologies and get over some of the hurdles in the market that way. From that work, we produced this chart, which I'm not going to dwell upon because obviously the scale is rather small, but you'll see that there are ways to split up the types of technologies that I've been talking about along different axes. And in this one, I chose to have an x-axis, which is the barriers to market entry, and those are lower for smaller scale and consumer technologies. And then unit size on the y-axis, and you'll see that some of the things I was just talking about solar PV, batteries, electric cars, fuel cells, heat pumps, air conditioning, those are smaller and more modular. And then we still have some of these large scale facilities in the top right hand corners. And where you are placed on this chart, I think is very important to the types of policies that are going to be needed for deploying them. We've also done some work with the European Patent Office. This is from a report that was published last year on patents and the energy transition, where we started to categorize clean energy patents into different groups depending on what service they provide in the energy system. And I think what I'd like to say with this chart is to just look at how much more invention is happening, or patentable invention is happening on the end use side within the this category of energy technologies. The clean energy is being driven in patenting sense by end use technologies, things that are related to energy efficiency and ways to use energy, also household appliances, whereas energy supply technologies have actually been declining in invention in the last 5 years. And that's only recently then been kind of complemented by an increasing enabling technologies like batteries, hydrogen, smart grids, and carbon capture, utilization and storage. But the driver is not on the renewables side. The driver is not on the supply side anymore. And so I think that's another reason why cities are going to be an important part of the future. On the venture capital part, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I recognize that time is tight, but the dotted line here shows something close to what we're expecting to see for 2021 early stage venture capital investment into clean energy startups. It's a huge increase. We're now in, I hesitate to use the term, but we're in boom territory for equity investment in what people are often calling climate tech now. We split it out into energy categories, and low carbon transport is a real driver here, but also energy efficiency and increasingly energy storage and hydrogen. This shows that investors really believe that there is market value in these new technologies, and they think that it's worth competing and trying to disrupt the market and disrupt traditional businesses, not just in the long term, but this decade. And venture capital cycles really do look at 5-year terms for trying to get a return on investment. So to close this sort of fairly rapid gallop through the territory here, I wanted to put together a few thoughts on why cities and municipalities can be launch pads for innovation and change, and I think hopefully some food for thought for why people that are looking at energy and municipal governance will be kind of excited by this presentation and look at what they can do. The first area is infrastructure. In some technologies, it is going to be better to deploy them first in urban areas because of the high population and building density. And here's just a few examples. Electric mobility. You've got the density to do the charging. And there's also additional challenges that come with urban deployment of electric vehicles that I think will be solved in cities first, and then that will feed into what happens elsewhere. But also, how do we make the retrofit of multi-occupancy buildings smooth and smart and based on some of these mass manufacturing techniques? There's a lot of innovation that can happen there that without the infrastructure investment in cities, for some of these technologies, I don't think they're going to get into the market as quickly. I don't think our chances of reaching net zero is going to be as high. But there's a second reason, which is that cities are amazing venues for innovation. There is something that a physicist called Jeffrey Rush has proposed, which is a law when he looked at the innovation data that showed that, you know, for every increase in the size of a city, I think it's a 3/4 power law in terms of the amount of innovation that is going on. There's a big sort of exponential step up in how much innovation happens in larger cities. And when we looked at what governments are doing to support clean energy startups, we saw a lot of good examples of actually incubators in cities, ways in which non or sub-national governments can actually encourage the innovation ecosystems in cities, partly because they already have the universities to be able to exchange ideas. In some cases, they have great laboratory services. They might host national labs, and you can bring people together more easily to create new ideas. And big new ideas are needed in some of these deep tech areas: materials, biotech, electrochemistry, and in digital. And we do see, certainly in digital, that, you know, the biggest new ideas are coming out of a fairly small number of major innovative cities. And so policy is going to be crucial to being able to accelerate and recognize in new innovations that can then be brought to market and attract the right capital. And I've added a last point here, especially if they work together. I think that, you know, we work a lot at the IEA on intergovernmental, international cooperation. Intercity cooperation is hopefully going to be a feature of accelerating the technology innovation that we need for a net zero future. So I will, I think, close there. Thanks so much for listening.
And thank you, Simon, for sharing your thoughts and insights. And we surely look forward to hearing from you more during the Q&A session. Now, let's go to Diana's presentation for today. And she's going to talk about the strategic planning tools as well. So she's very excited as well. So hand over to Diana.
Thank you very much. Okay, very warm welcome also from my side, and thank you very much, Simon, for attending the session, and Professor Lee for hosting the session. And it was very interesting to learn from Simon about all the uncertainties and how much actually depends on policymakers, but also how much depends on technology and on actually behaviors of individuals. So I would like to show you an example of how local authorities can actually address all these uncertainties in their strategic planning, particularly related to energy transition. And for this, I have selected an example from an currently ongoing project where we are part of. So the project is called Access, which stands for Advancing Communities Towards Low Carbon Energy Smart System. And this is a European project. So European Union has decided to become carbon neutral by 2050. And of course, due to urbanization, cities play a major role in achieving national net zero targets. Local authorities face an increased number of challenges which reach from technology-related challenges, finance, but also challenges related to the governance processes and policies. So within the Access project, we aim to support local authorities in development and implementation of a coordinated approach for strategic planning for energy transition in particular. So Access project incorporates 4 core elements, which are a consortium, which consists of local authorities as well as experts from different disciplines. All of them are located across Europe from different countries. We have actual 4 technology demonstrator projects within Access. And we develop an upscaling framework which incorporates practical tools and processes from different disciplines which can be used for urban planning and practices. And finally, we also develop an approach how to roll out those strategies and also how to replicate them, how to share learning on sustainable energy transition. So in following, I would like to go through these 4 core elements and show you examples of our work. So starting with the consortium, which you can see here on the slide, and you can see here that we have 4 different university and RTOs participating in the consortium, and we have 4 different municipalities which are part of it. And we have one further company who is project management company, but they're actually having a great expertise in the area as well. So altogether, we work on 4 demonstrators. And the demonstrators aim not only to showcase the actual technological solution or concept, but also to showcase the relevant business model or potential business models, which will enable the upscaling and rollout of these technologies at large scale. So 2 councils, which are West Suffolk, actually here nearby by Cambridge, and Amersfoort, are looking into so-called peer-to-peer trading, which is a local regional platform which enables a trading of energy between different participants, which are not necessarily coming from original energy sector. So this can be, in the case of West Suffolk, these are businesses. So they have implemented this platform for industrial side, which has not only manufacturing companies, but also commerce companies there who are now enabled through different sensor technology and control and monitoring technology to actually exchange energy between each other at a local level. Amersfoort is looking in a similar concept, but then particularly for private households. And the goal in both cases is to show how we can actually enable integration of higher amount of renewable energies when we enable the original consumers to become prosumers and actually trade energy. And then we have City of Malmö and City of Mechelen, who are building a so-called smart car park, which has electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and in addition, PV panels, battery storage technology, as well as a control and monitoring system, which helps them to manage the power loads. And the idea behind this smart car parking is that it can actually provide grid services. So in times of grid constraints, it can act as a supplier of energy or as a storage. And of course, these pilots are just a small puzzle in the big picture of energy transition in these cities. And therefore, within Access, we're also looking on the overall topic of upscaling and thinking about it in a systematic way. So what are the approaches which will help the municipalities to copy the approach they took in this pilot to any other pilot in their city, but also enable other cities to learn from them and have a proof of concept of how to approach demonstrator planning and upscaling. So to do so, we use tools from different disciplines, which are starting from engineering. So for example, modeling and simulation practices, technology and innovation management methods, and also methods from sustainable urban planning, as well as from governance and policy research. And all this interdisciplinary expertise and tools we put together and create, as we call it, a framework or a toolbox, which helps to integrate this success from individual pilot into the entire picture of energy transition in the cities and helps them to become more efficient in terms of planning development time of such pilots, in terms of also reducing the costs of it, but also overall contributing to their goals and targets. And I would like to show you one example of such a tool, which we particularly use to think about the future and the uncertainties on the way, and make cities ready to whatever might happen in the world in the future, however it might look like, that they're ready and they're still able to pursue their targets, their strategies and targets. And the question which we were answering with this work was, what are the topics or topic areas which are key for local authorities to develop initiatives in these topics, which will support them reaching their future energy transition goals. And again, independently of how the future might look like. So to answer this question, we used a foresight analysis, which helped us to develop hypothetical scenarios of the future. And the analysis comprised 4 main steps, which started with the first step of mapping and understanding what are actually trends and drivers of change. And we came up with a list of, I think, more than 130 trends and drivers. And of course, we had to prioritize these trends and drivers in terms of their importance. And to do so, we assessed their uncertainty and their impact. Because in particular, drivers with high uncertainty and high impact are most important to be addressed in strategic planning for energy transition. So then in the following step, we also assess the correlation between these high importance drivers. And this enabled us to define scenario axis and define the 4 future scenarios. And then in the final step, we explored what are the relevant requirements or needs of different stakeholders of the city's ecosystem, what are the initiatives or prevention measures, or any enablers or barriers to their implementation. So I would like to show you this list of the high importance trends and drivers, which are basically high uncertainty and high impact trends and drivers for energy transition at local level. And to group these trends and drivers, we use the PESTEL framework. I think it's quite familiar, commonly used. And I don't want to read out all the trends and drivers here on the list, but just highlight some of them. So for example, national and global political instability, or on the other side, the number of countries, which is increasing, who are committing to net zero goals, who are committing to international collaboration in terms of aligning their policies and exchanging their practices. Of course, availability of funds and investment, where Simon has already highlighted in his presentation, is very important. But also he highlighted the role of behaviors and behavioral changes in achieving net zero targets. And in cities, it's particularly the active role of its citizens. Of course, technology, digital technology, but also the clean energy technologies, which actually many of them are already there and they're existing, but there's still a lack of their mass deployment. Then there is another topic which might be is an important driver, the introduction of carbon pricing at either European or even worldwide level. And finally, but yeah, very important, the climate change is happening faster as we thought, and we observe more and more increase of scarcity and global competition for resources, for different type of resources, not only relevant to energy supply, but also to material, land use, and so on. So by understanding this, what drives us, what drives the change, why do we need to conduct strategic planning and think about the future, we were able to define 2 axes. So the horizontal axis basically describes the resources usage. And on the very positive side, we have a sustainable distributed use of resources, and the opposite extreme are basically degraded ecosystem. And the horizontal axis describes carbon cost and carbon pricing, which can be regulated, agreed worldwide and sufficiently high, or the opposite, of course, unregulated or not high enough, and therefore inefficient. So I just would like to introduce you to the 4 scenarios, which are basically resulting from the 4 quadrants of this figure. And I would like to start with the top right scenario, which is our best case scenario, and therefore we called it Nirvana, because in this scenario, the global economies were able to demonstrate a strong commitment to mitigation of climate change. They were capable to collaborate, to achieve mutual agreement on policies, on mechanisms. And overall, the society pays a lot of attention to ecosystem and biodiversity protection, and therefore uses the resources on a very sustainable manner. Moving further to the scenario B, which describes a situation, a potential future hypothesis where everyone becomes responsible. So, which means in this scenario, the economies were not able to agree on international carbon tax or pricing. However, there's still a lot of agreement on importance of mitigation of climate change, and therefore there's a range of different agreements in terms of fostering renewable energy systems rollout and other clean tech associated with climate change. And in this scenario, technologies like, for example, wind and solar power became competitive and are widely used. And therefore, there may be also a point where carbon taxation or pricing is not needed anymore. Okay, moving now to the left side, to scenario C, which is our worst case scenario, and therefore we called it collapsing anarchy. Well, this scenario describes a hypothetical world of degraded ecosystem of societies with unregulated, ineffective carbon pricing. And even so, there were some efforts to mitigate climate change. They were unsuccessful, and the outcome was negative. Fossil resources still play a main role, and this leads to a situation of something like the strongest will survive. And therefore, there's a lot of inequality in terms of energy access, but also in terms of all other resources. And the consequences of this inequality is that there is a rising number of conflicts, even military conflicts, in order to secure and protect local resources. And finally, move to the top left corner of this figure, to scenario D, which describes a situation with a lack of policy and a focus solely on greenhouse gases emissions. So in this scenario, the global community has finally managed to agree on a common regulation and pricing for carbon, but the focus is too much on greenhouse gas emissions, and all other impacts, anthropogenic impact on our planet are not well considered. And therefore, we are still in the situation that we face degradation of ecosystem and a scarcity of resources. Okay, so we have these 4 hypothetical scenarios. How they can help us or help local authorities to plan their energy transition strategies. So for each scenario, we further explored the details. For example, what are the needs and requirements of different stakeholders? What are different initiatives and measures which can be undertaken at a local level? And what are any enablers and barriers? And the following question was, is there actually a middle, a list of cross-cutting topics which are relevant to each scenario, and this independently, whether the scenario is perfect world, thriving future, or more on the negative side? And what are these topics which will be very important independently of how the future might look like, and which the local authorities need to consider in their strategic planning? And with this analysis, we came up with a list of 7 cross-cutting topic areas, which can be considered at a local level in terms of, okay, in these topics, we might want to put or plan projects, initiatives, or any further activities. So I would like to start with setting up of technical assistance programs which can be guided and led by local authorities in order to foster and proactively initiate case studies, demonstrators and pilots, which will stimulate and inspire take-up of a new innovative technologies for energy transitions. Then there is another area where local authorities can be very active and thriving if they use the information and data and they present it the data on climate change and impact at a local level in order to increase the awareness and understanding of different stakeholders within their ecosystem. Then, of course, incentivizing and helping local stakeholders to get access to technical expertise, but also to the capital in order to be able to invest in innovation. And which again links very nicely to what Simon has outlined earlier, is fostering citizen cooperation. So actively engaging with citizens, engaging them in, for example, designing the solutions for local energy transition, and also making them part of the decision-making process, because this will help actually to thrive the behavioral change, because this will help the citizens to feel this is what I am committed to. You have my buy-in because my perspective and my ideas were considered in our strategy. Of course, training and education has an important role, and there's a lot in terms of programs which can be done at the local level, programs for all types of stakeholders, for citizens, but also for private sector and as well as for politicians or policymakers. Collaboration between local authorities, so not only trying to solve all problems in your own region, but actually look outside of your region and try to see where we can exchange, where we can learn from great examples at the different city or municipality. And finally, not less important, is active contribution to development of effective policy and regulation at a higher level, at national and international level. And this is what our example of our project shows, where we have local authorities from different countries who work together, learn from each other, and bring back the knowledge and learnings to their own countries. So to summarize, we have this list of topic areas where local authorities can use to ideate and plan different projects and initiatives related to energy transition. And then there is a question how to roll out and replicate all this work. And within Access project, we have set up kind of 4 approaches to help this. First, of course, Access cities are willing and actually very keen and interested to integrate all the learnings and methods in their decision-making processes. But they're also very active in setting up city support groups where they meet and coach other peer cities on energy transition, investment planning, facilitation of the process, and so on. Replication at regional level is, of course, also very important. So to keep the eyes open and see are there any other opportunities to actually pilot this technology or set up those demonstrators within our region. And finally, of course, all our partners in our consortium are engaging with a variety of stakeholders all around the world, with decision makers, with private and public sectors, with universities, and we are very open and willing to create a network of people who are interested to exchange their ideas and together to mitigate and tackle climate change, which is the biggest challenge for all of us. Thank you very much from my side, and I hand over to Jung now.
Yeah, thank you, Diana, for sharing invaluable experience from the Access project, and then we can understand how the strategy planning tools play critical roles to implement in energy transition as well. Kimberly, you think you can upload the slide for us? There's one thing prior to go to our Q&A session. I would like to announce the training courses organized by the IFM Engage. IFM Engage will be launching the new short courses called the Smart City Strategy Planning and Strategy Implementations, which starts with the 5 sessions on the first week of September until the 15th of September as well. The course will cover various training modules for how to formulate and execution strategy planning for the smart city. I mean, smart city is a very wide topic, so energy can be actually one of the topics, or mobility. So we will try to train in courses with, as Diana was just mentioned, a few tools and the techniques based on the global practices. Furthermore, we're looking at how we're going to measure the KPIs for strategies, and different tools and technique can be introduced and learning through the real use cases as well. So hence, I do hope that you can join us, and you surely can find out more on IFM Engage homepages as shown in the slide as well. So let's go over to our Q&A sessions, and there are perfectly with the time. There are 2 questions for each of you, and our one from Sandra Bucci. I'm sorry that I pronounced correctly, I don't know, but the question is to Simon: how can we make sure today that the collective effort from all governments in the world is put into the creation of the stated policies that will support the changes needed? So Simon, do you think you can answer these questions for us?
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, I personally, we work on policy, particularly with national governments a lot, and answering this question is a little bit like answering how do we tackle climate change in total, because we're strong believers in the importance of government action. Now, the question refers to, in a way, to our scenarios, and there's different levels of policy making that we track. Governments, I think, in recent years, there's become this kind of competitive target setting, which is really great to see. We've had this sort of rush to for all countries and regions to put in place targets to get to net zero emissions by 2050. So we have this as our highest level of making a commitment, but our stated policy scenario only includes those policies that are being translated into legislation and regulation. Some of the policies that are in that scenario, are not quite sort of finessed in terms of what the exact regulation is going to be. So the question is really about how do we get governments to move from the high level targets to having the policies on the statute books that are actually going to effectuate the change. And what's really important, I think, to recognize is just how much of that change needs to happen this decade. Huge amounts of upscaling need to go on in the next 10 years. In the same way that the target setting has almost become a sport and has been greatly enhanced, I think, by some countries going first and others feeling pressure to go behind, or recognizing that this is possible. I think that the same happens in a way in policy making. The ability to see other countries succeeding in, for example, electric car deployment, smart meter deployment, or renewables permitting, and to be able to understand what is working in practice really makes it much easier for the next countries to come behind. So having forums for knowledge exchange, I think, is important, and also broadcasting within countries what other countries, or we can take that down to the local authority level, what other local authorities are achieving, and making everybody jealous and envious and want to have that level of progress on their side. I don't think that's fully answered the question, but I hope it's a couple of good ideas.
Yeah, very good. I think one question from Diana, from David Lomond. What can local community do in a practical way to be proactive on energy transitions? And also adding up that question, Sandra was asking how a local authority can be involved in the Access project. So Diana?
Yeah, thank you very much, David and Sandra, for raising these questions. So maybe start with David's question. I think the first barrier which we have seen in our work with an access project is actually originally as a local government or local authority, you not necessarily had the responsibility for energy systems, right? So I think, and originally, traditionally, we have companies who are responsible for energy supply, for the grids, and so on and so on. But now the world is changing, and I think there's a lot of coordination and a lot of knowledge exchange is needed. So we cannot optimize each system individually. So electricity, heat supply, mobility, and so on. I think to leverage real synergies and real impact and achieve our goals on energy transition, it's important to integrate and apply system thinking to all this energy related parts of the system. And I think this is exactly where local authority can take a coordinating and facilitating role. So practically, it was a bit maybe high level, but practically, what can you do? You can set up an interest group on energy transition where you have different perspectives within your city represented. So maybe the energy company, but also your businesses who are located in your city, your citizens, of course, and maybe some mobility companies and so on. And having this task force, I think then you can think about, okay, what our resources, and with resources, I not only mean assets, but also capabilities. So what knowledge do we have? What expertise do we have locally, which can we utilize in order to achieve quick results? So making some maybe small scope projects, but which will create impact and show that, yes, there is something we can do proactively. So I think this is one suggestion. Another suggestion, and it also relates to Sandra's question, how to engage in access project. There are different ways, and as I mentioned, we have this city support groups where you can engage with our local authorities, and they can just exchange with you about their experiences and projects and initiatives they are putting in place. But also we're actually currently collecting different case studies related to the 7 topic areas which I have explained to you. So if you are interested to be part of it, because we then will share all the expertise in the community of this case study. So if you are interested to be part of it, please get in touch anytime, or also please get in touch anyway. So I think we will always find a good way to collaborate.
Right. Okay, so some questions for you, for Simon. How is the current energy crisis changing the outlook for the decarbonization and policy priorities? Do you think you can answer very short terms?
I mean, the short answer is that it's having a tremendous impact. The long answer, I'm afraid we don't have time for, but it's a hugely fascinating, but also, in some ways unfortunate and disturbing topic to be working on at the moment in terms of the stability of energy systems.
That's right.
I would direct interested people to the IEA website, where you will find the 10-point plans that we published around how to reduce reliance on oil and gas quickly. And there's a huge amount there that is really on the end use side. If you want to do something quickly, then drive less. And we were recommending some things like, have car-free days in cities. So there's this whole, what do we do in the near term? And does that introduce new behaviors that will make it easier for us to make the longer term transition, even though it's going to involve some hardship? But in broader terms, it's the situation in Ukraine is coming on the back of a situation where we had tight oil and gas markets last year because of the recovery from the pandemic and tension in supply chains. We also have more interest from countries to what is called kind of reshore manufacturing, to host the value chains for making batteries and electric vehicles themselves. And now we have these incentives to try to get away from especially natural gas more quickly in the longer term. So it's not just the Ukraine situation. If you put these three things together, there are some indications that we can make certain transitions more quickly, that electric cars have more consumer interest, more policy support. There's really big ambitions for things like hydrogen, So there's a possibility that, if the investment can be there, and obviously the needs of consumers in times of high prices need to be paramount, but if the investment is also there for some of these low carbon technologies, then the period from 2030 onwards might actually be easier to navigate.
Okay, there are two more questions I would like to finish off. So one question is, so what are the to Diana, what are the key tasks for the making sure that the demonstrate the projects or testbed project can be scaled up afterwards? So scale up issues is quite critical for smart city as well, isn't it? So do you think you can for that one, Diana?
Yeah, I think it's one of the questions, core questions to our work and our project. And I think the answer to it is, first, please start thinking about it from the beginning on. And often it happens that the focus is on solely technology and building the demonstrator, but actually, what is the business model behind? So who will be responsible to run it at large scale? So is it the energy grid operator? Is it energy supplier? Or is it a completely new company which needs to be established, and then by whom? So there are, of course, the independence of the topic, of the technology, there are different models possible. But as a city, you have, I think, the power of actually bringing all the stakeholders together and elaborating it together with them, and being the kind of in the middle, like a middleman who is facilitating these conversations and help to find a solution. Yeah.
Okay. Last question, I think, from the Hoon from Korea. I think the most of sustainability activities are driven by the developed countries. What would be the key challenges to the driving governmental level environmental sustainability innovation in developing countries? I think that probably the big question for that. Because of the Glasgow, we saw that some of the developing countries was a little bit hesitating on these issues as well. So, Simon, do you think you can answer this question?
I don't know if I can answer it, but I love this question because this is so important.
Yeah.
We have, in our net zero emissions scenario, we estimate that the world needs to invest something like $4 trillion every year on average. And most of that money actually needs to be invested in emerging and developing economies, because that's where the transition, we have the growth, we have investment that's going to happen anyway, and we also need to make the transition onto the right path to avoid locking in emissions. We're actually doing some work at the moment with experts and governments in quite a large number of emerging market and developing economies on what does an innovation system look like in these countries, and how is it different from the advanced economies. I haven't got time now to go into some of the really great examples and some of the great aspirations that these countries have in order to be participating in clean energy value chains in the future. But I would certainly thank the questioner for raising this, because we didn't touch on it elsewhere in the talk.
Right. This question was raised by Ingrid as well, but I'm afraid we are running out of time as well. So I need to actually closing our webinar today as well. And thanks for the both speakers for excellent, speak about this energy transition. Is very exciting topics as well. And I hope that we can host another event. We are planning to do it on July time as well. But I think that for time being, I would like to say that goodbye and hope that you have an enjoyable day in UK and Europe as well and elsewhere. Thank you.